Hello everybody. How are we doing today, Psych of Emotion? This is being recorded on 9/21, September 21st, so we can argue that this is maybe the first day of spring, the equinox, so there's that. Some people argue it's tomorrow on the 22nd, or somewhere in between. Regardless, happy fall. I said spring earlier, didn't I? Yeah, okay, happy fall. The weather's also already starting to feel like it. I'm up here in the Caddick, no air conditioning today, and it's relatively pleasant. A lot of cats around, so there's that too. Let's talk about the biological understandings of emotion, and one of the first concepts that we need to discuss here is this idea of universality. Darwin advances universality thesis, and therefore the biopsychology explanations or biopsychological explanations abound or conferred high levels of credibility because they're universal and they apply in a great number of contexts to a great number of creatures on the planet, right? One of the ideas that comes from this is emotions are hardwired. So emotions, and this is probably the first time we've encountered this term in this class, that these are an evolutionary legacy. This means that these are in our DNA, the potential for these emotions, and expressed within our brain structures. They represent primitive systems, and they're involuntary and irrational according to Darwin and those who kind of follow his path, right? Emotions are vestigial capacities, kind of like your appendix. So we can make an argument that they're not really necessary in the current day and age of rational man. Now that's up for grabs, but it's not hard to kind of advance the idea that reason's going to get us a lot further in life than emotion will. And emotion often operates to our detriment, where reason rarely does, right? So a lot of people at this point in time are making an argument that what are emotions good for? Are they something that we would best shed to, not have part of our legacy? So this universality maintains a dualistic paradigm, and it's the rational versus the irrational, the individual versus the social, the cognitive versus the emotional, thinking versus feeling, right? This is a new brain-body dualism as it's creating. So now we're not talking head and heart or soul and reason. Now we're talking actual observable mechanisms within the body and observable behaviors. So the expression of emotion, of the emotions in man and animals, one of Darwin's early works, right? This is circa 1872. What is Darwin then looking at? He's transcendent characteristics of the human being are stripped away. And this is what made Darwin so controversial at that point in time. Notice most people are coming from a religious point of view and they say man is set apart from animals. Man is set above animals. Animals are for man's use. And those are very common religious perspectives. And Darwin's going, no, the deal is man is just another animal, right? He's different than some animals, and animals are different too. So there's nothing special about being human in kind of Darwin's taxonomy, right? It's the divide between humans and animals is dissolved because we're all kind of in the same game and we're all of the same stuff, right? We can all be reduced down to our kind of cellular components, which in looking at man and animals then makes us essentially identical. Darwin was interested in the work of Charles Bell, who was a physiologist, and physiology was huge at this point in time. And they start studying that the human face has unique musculature, and Bell is that this is evidence of God's design. So this is kind of the intelligent design discussion. How do I reconcile science with my belief in God? Well, God is the designer, so that is, and the musculature is fascinating, it's intricate, and at this point people are even seeing certainly evidence of the presence of God, because something like this couldn't have happened by chance. Now Darwin, on the other hand, is going to come at that from a different angle. And it becomes kind of a wedge between various groups. Darwin abandons this God hypothesis, but embraces the study of facial expressions. So it's like, Bell, you might say the face is evidence of God. I'm not going to go there. This is physiology, this is musculature, and this shit is fascinating, right? So Spencer, Bain, Duchenne de Boulogne, all were working with facial expressions but had creationism in their theories. Darwinism is the one who abandons the creationist and goes to the evolutionary theory. But we have another example of what's called kind of scientific zeitgeist. Notice that there's a bunch of people studying on parallel tracks. So the face becomes interesting for its physiology to a wide range of people at the same time. It's like the thing to do at this point. Darwin discredited creationist theory, and thus he really kind of won the game. All the other theorists kind of lost out on this one. So we can see here, we can see Charles Bell does this unique mapping of the nerves and the facial structure, right? And as we move through his book, we see all these various pictures and diagrams, an explanation of emotion and what they're for and how they occur, that are going to be largely abandoned. They'll be built upon but kind of discarded pretty quickly. Let's go to Down House. And Down House is Charles Darwin's home. I had the great fortune to do the travel abroad, psychology and culture, with 17 of our OSU psychology students 2 years ago. The instructor set up the trip at the last minute, couldn't go, and they asked me if I'd step in and go, and I was like, oh my God, that would be so cool. And this is one of the places we went. So this is where Darwin lived, and these are his gardens, and it was just so cool to be there and walk the paths that Darwin had walked. And he was a big walker. And this is often how he would get past his kind of intellectual impasses, go out and take a walk and kind of gain illumination for having done so. So, the study of emotion in man and animal, he who admits on general grounds, right, that the structure of habits in all animals has gradually evolved. Evolutionary theory is not just applied to the body, but to behaviors as well in Darwin's world. We'll look at the whole subject of expression in a new and interesting light. So now facial expression takes on a whole wondrous new set of potential explanations, causes and effects. But he acknowledges that the study of facial mechanisms is difficult. Right? Movements are often slight, maybe not discernible hardly at all. Movements are often fleeting, and this gets back to the fourth dimension that I'm going to talk about in this class, is that we see an expression. Did I actually see that expression? Because it's already disappeared, that these movements are fleeting. Hence the beauty of photography, right? Our sympathies are often excited by deep emotions, which can further kind of make it, if we're trying to tie an emotion to a situation, well, but it might be coming from somewhere else. Our imagination can lead us to misinterpret expressions via situational expectations. And you know, social psychologists have looked at expectations for literally decades. That is, how do expectations affect our perception and what we perceive? So, potential facilitation of study may occur. Well, infants are thought to be better study subjects in certain ways. They often experience and display emotional expression with extraordinary force. So an infant screws up its face to cry. That's probably not something we're necessarily going to see that often in adult humans, but notice the inhibition to do so probably isn't existing in the child. The insane can also be a source of study on the basis of the potential to play the strongest passions, and take that for what it's worth. And we'll see some pictures that are kind of horrifying in this regard, because often the insane were not well protected, right? They were used more as research participants than they were human beings. The elderly, you know, given the thinness of their skin, might allow us to observe the underlying structure a little more usefully. Painters, sculptors, observers are likely unparalleled in their depth of study, and this is true. When we look at the enigmatic expression in the Mona Lisa, you know, Da Vinci worked so hard to capture that. But at the same time, the problem with the painter is, to what extent are we looking at the person's expression, but to what extent are we looking at the painter's interpretation of the expression? So it becomes confounded in that regard. The absence of the impact of cultural display rules as contaminants is useful, that often we're told not to express an emotion, and that would be a display rule. You know, boys don't cry, right? So it becomes difficult to then necessarily look at sadness in men where the cultural paradigm is don't cry or don't express sadness, right? The observation of animals expressing certain types of states may be useful to understand the underlying causal mechanism, less confounded by observer sentiments. That we can look at a cat without adding in necessarily a lot of information that shouldn't be there. And then we see plates in various books, and we see these different expressions. You can see they're numbered from this book, and measurements are be taken. So that was the work of some people, comparing to ancient history, etc., and the work of sculptors, etc. And then we can look at the animal models, and we can see the similarities that they're trying to strike, and we can see the various postures. Most of us looking at animals, if we know anything about animals, are pretty well able to read maybe what's going on with the animal. So Darwin is exposing us to a lot of information, but I think he's holding some back too. He's going to share secrets that he's going to release somewhat gradually, understanding that people might have a hard time accepting his messages. So natural selection, habits, instincts, well, this is the work of Darwin, his seminal work, The Origin of Species, right? By means of natural selection, this fantastic work that really just kind of turned the world on its head. Similar states of mind create similar movements. Well, that's kind of a universal hypothesis, right? Repeated associations are manifested in habits. So stimulus response, if this occurs again and again and again, then we might see habitual responses to stimuli, and we might see that then extend to different stimuli. Habits operate once formed with striking similarity to instincts, and that's a fascinating idea. Behaviorally, right? The difference is the source. Remember, if it's an instinct, then it's coming from some ancient part of the brain, but if it's a habit, then it's a newer formed relationship to a stimuli. But the outcome is the same, and that can facilitate the study. Natural selection removes instincts from the pool. That is, instincts that don't successfully lead to enhanced ability to reproduce are probably going to fall by the wayside. And I think one thing to understand about Darwin, this is a slow process. So if we look at, you know, kind of modern human as being a 40,000 year phenomenon or so, give or take, then we start asking the questions, God, I wonder what instincts existed prior to now that have gone by the wayside, and what instincts might be selected by the environment when we move forward. And it's hard because these occur multi-generationally, so we don't get to observe it occur necessarily. Now, culture, though, has the same potential to remove responses from the human script, so it might serve as a surrogate area of study. Now, general principles of emotional expression. Well, the principle of serviceable associated habits. Habits, states of mind, and expression are connected. So our response to a stimuli, the state of mind that a stimuli might evoke, and our emotional response to that state of mind can be acquired through the purpose through habit, right? And this is the principle of antithesis. Induction of an opposite state of mind creates a strong tendency of movements in an opposite direction. And we've built a whole level of research around contrast effects, that is, opposite reactions to a stimulus. No, much of what's being discussed now is also discussed in The Descent of Man. I don't think Darwin is amazingly hopeful about the future of mankind, right? And there's others that share this idea from a more social point of view. The principle of actions due to the constitution of the nervous system, independent from the first of will, independently to make habit, right? So direct action on the nervous system, and this notion of will, and what are we going to do with will, and the ability to intervene. If we go fast forward to Roy Baumeister around 2010, He wanted to step in for the hell of it and say, hey, is there such a thing as free will? And Baumeister's evidence for free will, he said, yes, there's free will, and my evidence of free will is our ability to inhibit a response. Committing the response doesn't necessarily demonstrate free will, but the ability to feel this response well up and about to act on it, but then choose to inhibit it, to not do it, interestingly, is Baumeister's argument for free will. And it kind of fits with this. Now, are we willing to entertain the idea that emotions can be described as purposeless, or perhaps in search of a new purpose, if you will? That's my question. Are emotions vestigial? Are emotions going to get us in? Are emotions going to get in the way of the evolution of mankind? For example, would you consider greed or selfishness maybe an emotion? And I know these are difficult questions, but let's just play it out and let's say, okay, greed is an emotion, and selfishness is an emotion, which manifests itself in a behavior of taking from others and not sharing. To what extent, then, does the future of mankind benefit from greed or selfishness, right? To what extent might that spell the demise of mankind? And we can play these scenarios out in our head. The idea is, though, that some things may not be useful, although we, in fact, give in to them. There are vestiges of a purpose long since behind us. This idea that there's limited resources and there's only so much. Actually, for human beings, I think we have the capacity to meet the needs of people within a society. So selfishness might, in fact, work against where we could maybe successfully grow. We still have a coccyx, a tailbone, an appendix, right? They remain just because they haven't disappeared yet. Raised eyebrows accompany surprise, opening eyes wide to quickly scan the environment. And here's an example of an emotional, a facial reaction that is still purposeful, right? So hair standing on end makes animals appear larger, but for us it probably isn't a useful vestige, right? It works well for cats, right? They look bigger, they shape themselves. You can see in that picture there. This is probably not something we need to do, although notice that we do puff ourselves up, especially if we're ready to get busy, if we're in a bar fight or something. Bottom line, the utility of emotional expression is little more than a fortunate addition, and maybe not useful at that. And we can explore this idea of culture, universality. Universal emotional expression is seen across cultures. This is one of Darwin's premises, and we're going to look at the neo-Darwinists who continue this argument, right? 2 points. Supports contention that animals and man share ancestors, and that one's hard to refute at this point. Humans have descended from a common progenitor, so as we look at all the human species, subspecies, etc., there's this universality, this commonality points to a common ancestor for both, let's say, Homo sapiens and Neanderthal, if you will. All right. Race becomes a failed concept. That race is a meaningless concept when we're talking about people. It just doesn't mean anything. It's races on observable, easily observable characteristics. Has nothing to do with anything. And unfortunately, many people still cling to this notion of race. We'll talk more about that as the course evolves. Darwin's taxonomy of emotion, then. So when we look at this, he wants to pin it back to the bodily system. So notice, when we talk Darwin, what is his theory? Well, emotions are universal to man and animal, right? And so the expression, what we see on the face, and he's going to fixate on the face to a great extent, although body comes into it as well, blushing. The bodily system that operates blushing is an increase of blood to the face, and the emotion that's tied to this, that's causal, is shame or modesty, right? Bodily contact, somatic muscles, right? Might be affection. Laughing, right, is part of the breathing apparatus, and it demonstrates pleasure, right? Hair standing on end is the dermal apparatus, demonstration of fear and anger. So you can just kind of go down the list here, but notice how they've been tied Are these emotions? Are these emotions? Well, yes, they're emotions, and they're emotions because the bodily system has been activated expressing these changes, right? So you can see when we're building an emotion theory, if we build an emotion theory of Darwin, there's got to be some kind of bodily component, some kind of evolutionary history for it to be included as an emotion on his list. So Darwin and determinism, opposed to dualism, that's going by the wayside. He aligned with materialism and empiricism like Hume, right? He's determinist. All actions are determined by habits, hereditary character, education, and chance. So, but this is a new determinism, right? You know, it used to be written, that is, the Lord writes, you know, on our life, and our life is determined by God. It's preordained, fate, all those good ideas. Darwin said, no, we're mechanisms, and we're predictable mechanisms that operate on the basis of habit, right? Based on our hereditary, but he says no free will. So he deviates from Baumeister, as I described a little earlier. But associationism, and we get back to Spencer, if you will, with associationism in our earlier assignments, right, is the source of habits and learning. And mental faculties can be inherited or learnt, right? So, one thing that we need to, as we finish up with part one here, is consider Darwin. You know, a lot of people said survival of the fittest is what Darwin said, and they are incorrect in that regard. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one that's most responsive to change. So the key is adaptability above and beyond anything else. Okay.